Though the college basketball season is still a ways away, bets that are won in February and March are actually won through great preparation. Greg Hoops Peterson has you covered on everything to get you set for the upcoming season with updates on the coaching carousel, the transfer portal, and a projected order of finish for all 32 Division I conferences. Now it is time for Hoopin' with Hoops.
Warmer from Lilo, welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Hoopin' with Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson. We've got a great podcast for you as we're going to be doing a little bit of a two-part chat here. We really didn't see a lot with regards to news and notes in college basketball on Saturday. Saw a couple small transfers. Don't worry, I will clean those up on the podcast tomorrow. But we've got Connor Ope who's going to be joining me. I know that a lot of you guys have been asking me on Twitter who some of my favorite teams are coming into the season, the teams that I think are big-time favorites. I've been talking about a lot of the teams I think are going to be having a big impact on the college basketball season as I've been looking in recent weeks at the transfers coming into the Big 12. I think that conference in general is going to be really good when you've got teams like Texas out there. Kansas is a program that I think has done a good job. I feel like Baylor is flying a little bit under the radar at this point. And Texas Tech, I don't think that they're going to be competing for a national championship or anything like that, but do not sleep on them, especially as a top 25 team. When you bring in a guy like a Kevin O'Banner, you bring back Terrence Shannon, even though you wind up losing Chris Beard as your coach, a lot of the fundamental pieces and a lot of the coaching staff that was there before is still intact with Mark Adams, so take a look at them. But Gonzaga is the team that I've got ranked number one going into the preseason, so we're going to be talking to Connor about that. We're also going to be talking to Connor about how the West Coast Conference is going to be much better this year than it's been in the past. This is a conference that, in my opinion, is really ascending, and what we've noticed is that there are a couple teams that are going to be absolutely sacked for this upcoming college basketball season, but the disbursement of talent in college basketball is very rich, and it's very rich within the mid-majors, so we're going to be discussing that as well. So we're going to have a wide-ranging conversation with Connor in the second and the third segments, and a lot of this is inspired by the fact that you guys wound up sending in a little bit of feedback, so hopefully I'm giving you guys what you want to hear on this podcast. If you got questions, comments, segment ideas, what have you for the podcast, you got one or two ways we all fire those in. First one is my Twitter timeline at JaronScorty1. Keep in mind, the letters EM, they mean does not matter, so as per usual, send these into the timeline. Other ways, find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated, and then from there, you're able to send your questions, comments, segment ideas, even if you have guest ideas, just anything that you want to hear on the podcast, you're able to send those in via that as well. And I was hoping to have a conference preview this weekend. Unfortunately, the guest I was supposed to have to preview the MEAC, unable to do it right now, so we're going to try to have that for next weekend. I'm lining up as many people as possible to be able to take a look at these conference previews because, as I've reiterated on the podcast last couple days, the news and notes is starting to wear down a little bit. We're going to be getting into a little bit more hardcore practicing relatively soon, so that'll give us a little bit more of something to talk about, a little bit of a strange period here in late July, early August, but certainly going to be taking a look at a lot of these conferences because rosters are now very much more set. We're maybe going to see another coaching change or two. We saw it last offseason, a couple unfortunate scandals come up with things like Penn State along with Wichita State, Texas State, so there's always that going on, but we by and large know a lot of what we're going to be getting for this upcoming college basketball season, so I'm going to be delivering on these conference previews relatively soon. And if you have yet to hear your favorite conference or your favorite team previewed, have no fear, going to do one for every one of them, so we've got you all covered there. And I know that many of you guys want to hear about some of the teams I think are going to be just absolute juggernauts this upcoming college basketball season. So we're going to preview the team that I think is number one in the first part of our chat with Connor Hope. We're going to go a little bit more broad in the second half. He does great work with Heat Check CBB and also does a podcast of his own, Hope and Rolf podcast. Last name on Rolf is spelled R-A-U-F. You're able to find that podcast wherever you get podcasts. So we're going to be chatting with Connor for 2 segments, starting next right here on Hoopin' with You with myself, Greg Hoops.
The Fall Line is a true crime podcast covering the coldest cases in the southeastern United States and occasionally beyond. We focus on the missing persons, the unsolved murders, and the unidentified does that don't get media attention. Empathetic and intensively researched, The Fall Line will take you on deep dives into unsolved cases that you've never heard of and make you wonder why you haven't. Find us wherever you listen to podcasts.
Las Vegas, Fruitful with Hoops, with myself, Greg Hoops, and it is always great to be joined by this guest as he does a great job with eCheck CBB. He's also one half of the Hope and Rolf podcast. You're able to find that podcast wherever you get this podcast, and the last name is spelled R-A-U-F, so that is one that is a little bit more tricky, and Hope is spelled H-O-P-E. That one is nice, clean, and easy for you, as it is Connor Hope joining me on the podcast. Does a great job following all things college basketball, much like myself, out here on the West Coast. And to be able to follow him on Twitter, you're able to do so at CondorianFM. And to be able to follow HeCheck CBB, you're able to follow them at HeCheck CBB on Twitter. Nice, clean, and easy. And Connor, it is always great to have you aboard. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Greg. Always a pleasure to hop on your show.
It is always great to have you aboard as well. And we have seen a lot of things go down since you wanted to play us joining me. And I do think that your alma mater, Gonzaga, in my opinion, should be the number one team going into the upcoming college basketball season. I know that you've done a good job along with so many others over there at HeCheck CBB with your early preseason rankings. I know that many of you guys, much like myself, do have Gonzaga at number one, but I do think that what we could wind up seeing this season is that the number one spot might be a little bit more of a turnstile than it was last year. As we know, it was Gonzaga and Baylor and really nobody else. I think the big thing is if Gonzaga winds up losing a conference game, then you wind up seeing some of those powers out there in the Big 12, like maybe a Texas if they get off to a good start, even say a Kansas. UCLA is getting a lot of love. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens this year, but I don't know how you feel about Gonzaga going into the year, but I've got them as my number one team, as I know that many people do.
Yeah, I have Gonzaga at number one. I agree with you. There are going to be a lot of teams next year that wind up taking that number one spot. Obviously, with the players that Gonzaga has coming in, a lot of freshmen and a lot of returning sophomores that had very limited bench roles last season are going to be relied heavily upon to be that fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh option. Also, given the fact that Gonzaga plays two of those teams you named in UCLA and Texas, and specifically Texas, given the amount of experience and the amount of high-level experience that they have joining. You know, we know that UCLA is running everything back and adds two really big pieces, but this Texas team has a new head coach, a lot of new players, where if it fits together and works right away, they could be the best team in the country at the beginning of the year and could quickly rise to that number one spot. But given the talent that Gonzaga has, you can't really get away with having one of three preseason favorites for National Player of the Year, as well as the number one ranked recruit in the country on the same team without having overwhelming discussion as the number one team in the country.
Yep, I am right there with you. What I think is going to be the biggest question mark when it comes to this Gonzaga team is what you're going to be able to get out of Andrew Nembhard, because we remember with Nembhard, he was a guy that while he was at Florida, the team underachieved a little bit, but I would argue that Nembhard was very efficient. Sometimes he didn't necessarily dictate the offense as much as he would like, and we saw that last year at Gonzaga. It was a little bit more of an ancillary piece. He would give the ball off to guys like Joel Ayayi. He would give the ball to Drew Timme, and he's going to be able to do a lot of that this year, because I think we've seen Chet Holmgren and his highlights from the FIBA U19 event, and my goodness, the guy is able to block absolutely everything. Guy has some of the longest arms ever, and he might be the skinniest guy I've ever seen play basketball. It is absolutely insane. He's like 7 feet tall, and if you told me he weighed like 150 pounds, I believe you, but he is absolutely tremendous. But I think that is the biggest question mark I have with Gonzaga, really having the backcourt run through Nembhard a little bit more with Joel Ayayi, wind up leaving, and Jalen Suggs, we all know, wound up getting drafted a little bit lower than a lot of people thought he was going to, but a bona fide lottery pick. But I still think, by and large, this is a team that's going to be in very good hands because of the gentleman who I mentioned down low as well.
Yeah, and I think the biggest kind of sigh of relief you can have as a Gonzaga fan looking at this backcourt is that it does fit very well into Coach Few's desire to have 2 point guards on the court at any given time. It's not just going to be Andrew Nembhard out there running the show at all times. Rasir Bolton, the transfer from Iowa State, can play the point guard. Now, he will likely be the 2017 Josh Perkins equivalent, where he is running the point guard position in situations in which Nembhard is not, more so than taking the role of the point guard. But you also have Nolan Hickman, a top 50 recruit coming in, who I've heard nothing but great things about in terms of his capabilities and his ability to take on a championship level point guard role. Andrew Nembhard and Bolton are both going to be those clear leaders in the backcourt. But when you have Hickman, who can run the point, you have Hunter Salas, who won't be running the point, but he can be a very excellent off guard if everything fits together. Dominic Harris as well, coming in for his second season. That backcourt, I don't have as much of an issue with as some people might. But obviously, the front court between Chet Holmgren, Drew Timme, and Anton Watson is going to be phenomenal next year. And that's going to be what drives this Gonzaga team. And we're not going to see the same Gonzaga style that we saw last year, where they beat you in transition. This is very much going to look, I think, very similar, maybe not exactly the same, because Timme and Holmgren aren't quite as physically imposing as Shemek Karnowski, but similar in tempo to that 2016-2017 runner-up team, where a lot of it's played in the half court. And I think when you have Nembhard in the half court, even last year in the half court, Nembhard was the better point guard on this Gonzaga team. So running these sets out of the half court, you have Chet Holmgren, who can stretch the floor like no other big in the country. I think that this team is going to be really difficult to deal with. And the only question marks I have is with the amount of youth and the amount of inexperience on this roster, how does everything come together? Because it can come together really well, and this will be a national championship contender. Or you can have the same issues that you've seen in the past with some of these Kentucky and Duke teams, where the freshmen and sophomores don't quite meet the expectations that are placed on them.
I agree with you, and I do think that having aspirations of this team going undefeated and trying to duplicate what they did last year until the national title game might be a little bit far-fetched, but that's because we haven't seen a single team go undefeated since the 1970s with Indiana, as we do have Connor Hope joining me on the podcast. And I do think that something that is also very good is the disbursement of talent that we're seeing in college basketball, because I think you'd agree, while Gonzaga is both of our number one teams, the gap between Gonzaga and whoever you want to throw out there at number two versus the rest of college basketball is going to be significantly more slim this year than it was last year. It felt like last year it was Gonzaga, it was Baylor. You maybe had your questions with Baylor when they wound up having their COVID scare in February, but really past that, it was those two teams. And then it was everyone else fighting for number 3, number 4, list goes on and on. This year, we don't have as much of that, because I know that some people have UCLA in their top 3, in their way too early top 25. I think that might be a little bit lofty, but they're a team that they're certainly going to be a Final Four contender. You can make the case for Texas. Heck, I think that you can make a good case for Kansas at this point. I think that they're going to be very good. You even take a look out there in the Pac-12. Oregon is a team that I think is a top 10 team and should be, and I think that they could be able to contend for a Final Four. We all know about Michigan and Purdue out there in the Big Ten. You can't forget about Villanova. List goes on. And I really think that when it comes to disbursement of talent and when it comes to these top teams, the gap between the top 2 and the rest, much slimmer this year than it was last year.
Oh, absolutely. And if you remember back to the 2019-2020 season, where we were talking about how much parity there was at the top of college basketball, and it was driven in that year by the fact that there were very few, if any, elite teams in college basketball. You can make an argument for that Kansas team, and I think that might be it. I think that was the only team that had any sort of argument at being elite, on the same level as the Gonzaga and Baylor team of last year. But I think this year you're going to see just as much parity at the top. And it's because you have right now, I would say, about 6 teams that are national championship contenders, another 6 to 7 teams that are going to be teams with clear second weekend opportunities, all battling for an Elite 8 Final Four spot. Part of it is the amount of movement that we've seen. You have teams like Kansas, Texas, driven entirely by the fact that they've added a bunch of pieces. Oregon added a bunch of pieces on the transfer market. You have Gonzaga and Michigan that have excellent incoming freshman classes and bring key pieces from last year's number 1 seed teams back. You have UCLA that runs everyone back and then some. I just think that this year in college basketball, you're going to see a lot of movement at the top, and it might give you a false sense of there are no great teams. And I think part of it is that there are just so many great teams this year. And it's because we've seen, and people might complain about the fact that there are a few of these teams that seem like these super teams, right? Texas and Gonzaga can both run 10 deep with, top 100 level talent in terms of the players that when they came in as recruits. Non-conference is going to be incredibly entertaining. And then some of these conferences, as you said, the Pac-12, the Big Ten, they're going to be just as fun.
Yeah, we're taking a look at some of these top teams, and I certainly think that you've got a couple of them. You want to mentioning Texas, the fact that they're bringing in so many pieces, and arguably a top 5 coach of college basketball in Chris Beard. I'm not even going to say arguably. If you don't have Chris Beard as a top 5 coach in college basketball right now, I really don't know what your criteria for a top coach is, but you've got that. But then you take a look outside of, I would say, maybe 7, 8 schools that you want to consider to be those super teams, and you've got a wide disbursement of talent. And I think that this is a good stopping point for part 1 of our chat with Connor Hope, and in part 2, we're going to be talking about how so many of these mid-majors have been able to accrue a lot of talent, how things are very equal aside from the top couple teams across the board. And we're also going to be looking at the West Coast Conference as well, a conference that Connor has a lot of familiarity with, and the fact that they are much improved for this upcoming season as well. That's on the other side right here on Hoop with Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson. And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Hoop with Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson. We are being rejoined by Connor Hope. Does a great job with HXCBB. He also hosts a podcast of his own, Hope and Rolf. Rolf is spelled R-A-U-F. You're able to find that podcast wherever you find podcasts. Does great work being able to cover college basketball on a day in and day out basis. And we've left off our chat talking about how while there are a couple teams that seem like they've got great depth, they seem like they are going to be powers out there in college basketball, there is a good disbursement of talent. And one of those conferences that has that and seems to be really improving, that would be the conference that Gonzaga is in, the West Coast Conference. BYU being able to bring back Alex Barcelo, that is absolutely massive for them. When you take a look at a program like a Loyola Marymount, they've been able to do a good job of rising up. Pepperdine won a title last year now. Winning the CBI is not necessarily the world's biggest deal, but hey, you wound up having a guy in Kessler Edwards wind up getting drafted. Pepperdine has brought in a couple transfers as well. They're a solid program. As we know, St. Mary's year in and year out, they've got that Australian pipeline going. I think they might be a little bit more down this year, but I even take a look at that sort of a conference like the Sun Belt, in which schools like Louisiana, schools like South Alabama, they've done a great job with the transfer portal as well. A school that you are very high on, UC Santa Barbara, they have formed themselves as a power along with UC Irvine. So I go down the list, and while you've got those top teams, you've got a bunch of really good mid-majors. Heck, I'll throw in there some of the teams from the WAC. You've got Stephen F. Austin joining that conference. You've got Grand Canyon that has done a great job. List goes on. And after I would say about those top 8 teams, you can see a bunch of mid-majors really be able to get in there, fight for top 25 spots, and make some noise in March.
Yeah, and I think part of it is that where the Power 6, high major programs were able to take advantage of a lot of these, newly and fortunately relaxed transfer rules, player movement, the freedom with that. These other mid-major, low-major conferences are fully taking advantage of the fact that a lot of their players are coming back for that 5th year. Given that, you have a lot of these teams that will have players returning for a 5th year where, in the past they wouldn't have them at their disposal, specifically because it's the conference I focus on the most. I think this is the most complete and deepest WCC that we've had since Gonzaga became a national championship contender. I think they probably get 2 teams in the tournament, but there's going to be as many as 6 that at some point in the season are going to be discussed as bubble teams. I just think that because there's so many of those teams right now in the WCC, and given that it is the WCC, you'll see Gonzaga and BYU are clear tournament teams. And then LMU, San Francisco, St. Mary's, and even Santa Clara are all right there as teams with a ton of talent that if they end up putting it together and can pull off an upset against BYU or Gonzaga, you have to have them right in there as a conversation for a potential first 4 game.
Right there with you. I do think that the West Coast Conference, they're going to be able to do a very good job of being able to rise up. And you even take a look at a conference like the Atlantic 10. St. Bonaventure is a program that I'm very high on. They're going to be bringing back a lot of their pieces. Richmond brings back absolutely everyone. I would argue that they were one of the more disappointing mid-majors along Northern Iowa. And as we know, Northern Iowa, that was just an unfortunate situation with A.J. Green going down. Who knows what winds up happening if he stays fully healthy, but those two schools are certainly going to be good out there. With VCU, they are losing Bones Highland. When you wind up losing a player that winds up getting drafted from the Atlantic 10, that's a little bit hard to bounce back from, but I even take a look at what a team like a George Mason is doing. George Mason is under a new coaching regime. They've done a great job of bringing in so many transfers as well. I think that they're going to be able to help out the strength of them. And when I just take a look at the landscape of college basketball, it feels like the disbursement is a little bit more even because no longer are we seeing like 8 5-star guys wind up going to Duke, 6 5-star guys going to Kentucky, and then everyone else is just fighting for the scraps. You're noticing that like Dayton has a top 50 recruit that's coming in. Stanford has been able to bring in some good talent the last 2 years when it comes to their recruiting classes. And I think that we're getting to a point where so many of these top players in college basketball, they realize, oh, I don't need to wind up going to Kentucky because if I'm riding the bench at Kentucky, while it is a big name program, I'm not going to be seen too much. Meanwhile, if I wind up going to, like, say, a lesser Power 5 school, a very good mid-major, like I wound up mentioning with Dayton, something like that, I'm still going to be seen because a lot of these smaller conferences still have TV deals, and I'm able to showcase myself getting like 18 to 20 points per game rather than coming in a reserve role.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and if you look at some of these top mid-majors, if you don't have St. Bonaventure as a top 25 team to start the year, you're doing it wrong. I think St. Bonaventure is going to be a top 25 team. I have them at 19. I know that most, if not all of the people over at Heat Check have them in the top 25 somewhere. Colorado State out of the Mountain West is also looking to be a team that will flirt with the top 25 along with San Diego State and potentially Nevada, depending on how much they can perform around Grant Sherfield. The Mountain West is going to be pretty strong at the top. The A10 is going to be really strong at the top. Like you said, there's a ton of potential in the Missouri Valley and elsewhere to have a lot of these teams improve. And you still have some of the top mid-major stars from last year returning. Oral Roberts is getting Max Asmus back. It's going to be really fun because you're going to have a lot of these teams at the top of college basketball, the powers competing for national championships. But then you're going to have a lot of these mid-majors that are going to be able to make legitimate noise in March when it comes to winning a game or two against some of these teams. So the entire season is going to be really fun, but especially when we get down to those, final 68 teams, all those games are going to be incredibly fun as well.
And I certainly hope that so many of these programs that we wanted mentioning, like in Nevada, I know that their non-conference slate, not necessarily the world's best, so that is going to hurt them a little bit when it comes to Selection Sunday if they're sitting there on the bubble. But I'm hoping that some of these schools that have yet to release their non-conference schedule, they wind up being afforded those opportunities to be able to go out and get big wins, because I do think that they can showcase themselves really well, as we do have Connor Hope of Heat Check CBB joining me on the podcast, because I know you want to mention in Colorado State along with UNLV, along with San Diego State. I actually wound up doing my Mountain West preview about a week or so ago with one of your cohorts, Eli Becker. He does an absolutely terrific job of looking at that conference. And I wanted to put in Colorado State at number 1, San Diego State at number 2. Seemed like he was in relative agreement with me. I won't speak for him personally, but I know that we seem to be in relative lockstep with that regard. Who you mentioned, Nevada, I put them at number 3. And if you take a look at those schools, if you take a look at the schools out there in the Atlantic 10, you brought up the Missouri Valley. I'll even bring up Buffalo as well. If these teams wind up getting the opportunities that they're looking for out of conference, like Buffalo has played Syracuse quite a few times out of conference, I think that for those in my sphere, the betting market, you're able to find a whole lot of value on these mid-majors, because the Power 5 schools, for one, they typically come out a little bit more flat when it comes to non-conference, and for two, I think that so many people look at the brand name alone and they think, oh, Syracuse should absolutely crush Buffalo. Meanwhile, Buffalo really, as we know, has a great program. And I think that that could be very meaningful for these mid-majors being able to rise the amount of bids that they're able to get in March, because we know that for such a long time, that number has been dropping and dropping and dropping. I think that we're starting to see the rise of that once again, though. Yeah,
if you look at a lot of these schools that are considered top 10 teams right now, most of them, when they attacked how to improve this offseason, it was entirely by adding transfers and established veterans of the college game, with the exception of, Gonzaga added a transfer, but they also added a ton of good freshmen. Kentucky went hard at the transfer market, but they still brought in really good freshmen. Same with Michigan. So it's a combination of adding that talent, but also adding that experience. And so when you have some of these top, or not necessarily top high major programs, but competitive high major programs that are looking at earning a spot in the NCAA tournament, and they're going up against a lot of these mid-majors that have the experience battle won. That is where you're going to see a lot of that value, because like you said, the younger, less experienced teams, even if they have better talent, may come out flatter when it comes to games in mid-November to early December.
Yep, and that's exactly what wound up happening last year as well. While Kentucky, I would argue, got very unlucky last year. That's sort of what happens when you wind up having inexperienced teams. They wind up losing a lot of those games late. Meanwhile, these experienced teams that have been in those situations before and have fallen short in the past, they realize, this is what I absolutely cannot do in the final minute of a game as well. So I think that it sort of goes hand in hand. And a pair of things that go hand in hand, Connor Ope and great college basketball knowledge and great college basketball content. You do a great job over there at Heat Check CBB. Really, all of you guys over there at Heat Check CBB do an absolutely terrific job. I know that you do the podcast, Hope and Rolf. I know you guys are going to be doing some previews in the coming months. This is getting to be very exciting because we have a lot of the roster set. We've still got a couple guys moving around on the transfer portal, but by and large, we do know what a lot of these teams are going to be looking like. I'm excited for it. I know that you're excited for it. So let the good people at home know what you've got going on right now and how people are able to follow along on social media and other platforms.
Yeah, so Brian and I are working on scheduling our next podcast. We were kind of gearing up for the draft in the past couple of podcasts. Our next one is going to be taking a look more at the next college basketball season. And then from there, we will start bringing on guests and having people come on to preview specific conferences and specific teams. We've got something big in the works at Heat Check, preparing for a pretty big preview of the upcoming season. They've been doing a great job of putting out interim articles here and there, but I think that's going to be the big thing to look forward to towards the end of the summer and into the fall is when that drops. But as Greg said, you can find Hope and Ralph podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and then you can find me on Twitter at CondorianFM, where I talk a lot about a little bit of everything. So not just college basketball. When there's no college basketball on, I'll talk about pretty much any sport. But I'm excited for the upcoming college basketball season. I think it's going to be really fun. There's going to be fans in the stands, which is going to make it even more fun. It's going to be one of the best seasons just purely from an emotional standpoint, I think, for a lot of people, because it'll be the first full season in 3 years.
And with having these fifth-year guys back as well, that is going to make the play all the better. And we saw with NIL wind up getting passed at just the right time as well. Guys that you typically expect to go to the NBA draft, they wound up coming back. So the level of play in college basketball, I'll argue this year, is going to be as good as we've seen really since the one-and-done era began. And now that Connor and everyone else over there at Heat Check CBB, they're going to be doing a great job of following every step of the way. So big thanks, Connor Ope, for joining me right here on Hoop with Hoops. No news and notes really today. We didn't see a lot in college basketball, so I've been really looking at your ideas that you've been throwing out there on Twitter. If there's something that you'd like to hear on this podcast, since this podcast is dedicated to two things: make you guys money and make you guys just more informed college basketball fans in general. You're able to interact one of two ways and get your voice heard. First way is my Twitter timeline at @GN_D1. Do not send these via DM. The letters EM, they mean does not matter. Other ways via an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. And then for the comment that they allow you to put in the Apple Podcast review, put whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast into there. I'm going to be also doing previews of every single conference in college basketball as well throughout the offseason. I was hoping to have one this weekend. Looks like I'll be just doing a bunch more for the upcoming next few weeks, so have no fear there. I'm going to be previewing every single conference on this podcast, and once we get into the season, I'm going to be giving you a signed total on every single game, every single day. And if you like all that, you're able to subscribe to this fine podcast, Hoopin' with Hoops, wherever you get your podcasts: Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. I'll be coming at you guys every single day throughout the season. I'll be coming at you guys every single day in the offseason. So I'll chat at you once again tomorrow. Thank you.